There are sort of two main treatment options for OCD that, have been pretty effective. So the first one is ERP, which is exposure and response prevention. And then more recently, there is also I-CBT, which is inference-based cognitive behavioral therapy.
Welcome to OCD Whisperer podcast. Today with me, I have Dr. Regina Lazarovich. She's a clinical psychologist and founder of the private practice Compass CBT, serving adults across California, Florida, and New York. She's dedicated her career to helping clients struggling with anxiety disorders, panic attacks, as well as OCD, perfectionism, disordered eating, and body image issues. She's passionate about using evidence-based approaches and meets clients struggling with food and body image from the health at every size lens, which is pretty cool. And today, I have the privilege of having her on my show. Welcome to the show, Regina.
Thank you so much, Christina. I am so happy and honored to be here and excited to
Yay!
have the topic today.
Yeah. So when we connected, and I will let anybody know who's listening, we're both actually turns out from Ukraine, which is cool, and been here for a long time, which is cool. But yeah, one of the things that we discussed, like to come on here and to talk about, is this one aspect of OCD called magical thinking OCD. And I know that people who've listened to the show or dive into the realm of learning about OCD maybe have heard, and if they haven't, this might be their first time hearing. But OCD can manifest in a lot of different ways. Like a lot of different topics can come up for folks. But this is one, I don't know that we all understand as well or cover as much, right? So I'd love to hear from you. Like, what is magical OCD? Or maybe sometimes people have maybe heard of it like superstitious OCD. But yeah, love to just get a little bit of the lay of the land from you.
Yeah, sure. So, magical OCD is a subtype of OCD, and it's characterized by ongoing obsessions and compulsions around superstitious or magical thinking, as you mentioned. And then, people do that in order to prevent something bad from happening to themselves or to others. And so the person with magical OCD believes that they will be responsible for a bad outcome if they don't perform these really specific, physical or mental rituals. But from an outside view, there's often no connection between what the person fears and these physical or mental compulsions. And even if the person with OCD logically understands that their feared consequences and compulsions are not really, connected, the fear of causing themselves or another person harm is so great that they will engage in those compulsions, just to be sure. So, for example, like a person with magical OCD may think, I'm going to tap on the table 3 times just to make sure that this meeting goes well. Like, what's the big deal? Just to be sure, and I have a bunch of other examples of magical OCD.
Yeah, I'd love to hear them because I think like one of the things is even I'm listening from the lens of if I'm, let's say, the person with OCD and let's say I don't know if I have this, would love to know like what does that really mean? Like what does it sound like? How can I recognize if maybe I'm dealing with it? So if anybody's listening right now, if you can give us some examples, like if I'm trying to figure out if I have this kind of OCD, like what would it sound like? What are the kind of things I'd be looking for?
Sure. So here are some other examples. So another example is someone might believe that they need to say drive safe to their spouse. Otherwise, their spouse will get into a terrible car accident and it'll be all the fault of the person with OCD. Or a person may be afraid to move objects in their environment, or, like things on their desk, or feel compelled to move them in a specific way and organize them in a specific way, just to, make sure that their luck doesn't change or to kind of have something go a certain way. Other typical things are for people to have lucky or unlucky numbers, objects, colors, songs, you name it, right? It's a very typical thing. And so, like, for example, if someone was wearing a red shirt when something bad happened to them, like let's say their boyfriend broke up with them, they may then avoid wearing red entirely. And that may spread to like not having red things in their house, not going into red buildings, etc. And so avoidance is a theme as well, and a compulsion. And some people, may be afraid to jinx themselves. And so if someone compliments them, they might say, take it back. Or, they may be avoiding acknowledging when good things are happening to them for fear that it will, again, ruin their luck. So I can keep going there,
Yeah, no, those are great examples. Actually, as you're talking, if I may, I do have a question that I think I could totally see anybody listening, like this is something I would definitely wonder, which is, so what's the difference then between like culturally having a superstition, right? Versus this, what we're talking about here, right? Because it could be like, well, but let's say, hold my breath while going through a tunnel and like, am, wishing for something, or maybe I'm doing it for good luck. Like, so how can I delineate between, something like that, or like, some cultures like, oh, don't step in a crack or a black cat. So how can I delineate, what's that versus when would it be something, to consider like this might be OCD?
Yeah, for sure. That's a really good question. And so the first thing to consider is the impact on the person's functioning and quality of life, right? With OCD, we will see a pretty detrimental impact on the person's overall, relationships, day-to-day life, just, quality of life. Another thing to consider is rigidity. So with OCD, you're going to see more distress if the ritual cannot be done, or, if it's interrupted. And so, like, for example, tomorrow is Friday the 13th in the US, right? Which is associated with like bad luck. And, somebody without OCD, if they need to schedule a medical procedure like a surgery, right? And it's like, oh, here's the only date we have, Friday the 13th. That might occur to them like, that's an unlucky date. Oh, well, let's do it, right? I need to get this done. Someone with OCD would absolutely not schedule their surgery for their date, even if it meant delaying like a really, really important procedure with health implications and, all of that. So it's the impact on functioning. And
I think the other thing I'm hearing, it's like one of them, it's kind of almost like, okay, I understand this is what we do culturally, or it's for luck or something, versus like OCD. What I'm really hearing is, there's this intense fear that comes online, seemingly irrational. And even if a person recognizes it, they can't distinguish that it's perhaps not rational, but that this thing takes over where like something horrible or something looming bad is going to happen, something catastrophic if they move forward. So this sense of urgency comes up of like, no, I have to avoid it at all costs, or I have to do these extra steps, or think a certain way, or count numbers, or whatever else to try to kind of cancel that out and prevent something bad from happening.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that sense of urgency. So like another example is, if someone, hears about like, something bad happening somewhere else, like we're in California, let's say a natural disaster, there's a wildfire happening somewhere, most people in the US without OCD would be like, oh, let me knock on wood so that it doesn't happen here. If there's a wooden table around. If there isn't, it's like, okay, right. If there is one, they'll knock. A person with OCD would absolutely knock on the table, right? If there is one, but if there isn't, they would find something else to knock on. It might be their leg. And if there isn't anything, or, that might be too obvious for other people to notice, they would say a special word in their head. They might say, wood, or say a little prayer. Like it would be imperative that something be done, right? Because there's this fear that if they don't do something, then this natural disaster will absolutely occur.
Yeah, and you kind of said something really important that I want to highlight for anybody listening, because you did mention, like, this is one of the things when you're dealing with OCD, is that if a behavior seems like it might draw too much attention or you might get embarrassed by it, people will find, right? Because we're human, we do adjust, and nobody wants to, feel like the oddball out. So in many ways, people will find a different way of how to meet that need. And so, like you said, oh, they might say a word, right? Or they might tap on their a side of their leg. And so it might seem really subtle, or it might become internal that you don't even notice. But if you're the one doing it, that's where I say slow down and pay attention to that. Like, are you doing something like that yourself because you're trying to prevent something bad from happening? And that it's not always going to be something that's just obvious that you see, like, opening or closing doors or flickering lights, that we hear in the media, right? Or washing hands.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, yeah, the stuff in the media, like, that is a part of OCD, but yeah, OCD is so much more complex and diverse in its presentation. And yeah, a lot of it is internal as well. And so, yeah, you wouldn't necessarily know from the outside always if somebody is really struggling with OCD.
Yeah. And so I really appreciate this conversation and just kind of getting more clarity for folks. Like, what could it sound like? What could it look like? Right. Just to understand magical kind of / superstitious OCD. And of course, what's the difference between just a superstition versus OCD driven. So now I'd love to kind of switch gears and talk a little bit about from your perspective and what you know, because of course the question always is, well, okay, now that I understand, what do I do? Right. So how do I address this? How do I get better? So what's your thought on that?
Yeah. So there are sort of two main treatment options for OCD that, have been pretty effective. So the first one is ERP, which is exposure and response prevention. And then more recently, there is also I-CBT, which is inference-based cognitive behavioral therapy, which I know you're also familiar with and practice, Christina. And so, I'm happy to kind of explain how treatment may work from both.
Yes, please.
So the first thing that, I think is interesting, I think there's this element of magical OCD that both ERP and I-CBT would probably agree on, which is that there is, thought action fusion happening, which is that when a thought and an action are being treated as if they're one and the same. So, like, thinking about my grandmother getting ill is the same thing as like making her sick, or thinking a blasphemous thought is the same as sinning. So that's one element that just can be helpful just from an awareness standpoint of like that might be happening. But from an ERP perspective, right, treatment consists of exposure, which is systematically facing situations that bring on distress, and then response prevention, which is not engaging in the compulsions. So, for example, if a person with OCD believes that someone close to them will die if they listen to a quote unquote unlucky song, they will avoid listening to that song, or and if they hear it on the radio, they'll turn it off and they'll say a prayer, right? So if I were to be doing ERP with them, I would slowly build up to facing that biggest fear. So we might first write down the name of the song, write down the lyrics, and then, finally listen to that song, all while not engaging in any compulsion. So in this case, not saying the prayer. When doing ERP, we can also bring in ACT, which is acceptance and commitment therapy. And so that would help us to generate more motivation and make the exposures more values aligned, or tie them into the person's values. So here in this example, if the song happened to be their wedding song, it's like, well, do you want to, be able to dance to the wedding song with your partner, or do you want to give in to OCD? So that's ERP. I'm happy to talk about I-CBT, but I don't know if you have any like. Okay.
No, I think that's pretty straightforward, and I love that it was very concrete and very specific of like what that would look like if you're using ERP. Because like anybody with OCD, and I mean, I'm open about my OCD, people know, but I certainly really appreciate when I can have a really clear set example, so I really can grasp and understand how could you apply the concept, right? Because one piece is learning something, the other piece is actually doing it, right? So yeah, but that was awesome. So ICBT, curious, what will ICBT offer here?
Yeah, so ICBT, as you know, is a mostly cognitive approach. And so it can help us really slow down the reasoning process that's creating OCD. And so that the person with OCD can understand, like, how did they reason their way into OCD, why they obsess and fixate on the specific things that they do, where the connection between their magical compulsions and the things they worry about came from, and what kind of person they fear being or becoming if they don't engage in these compulsions. And so, I like to use this metaphor of, and I didn't come up with it, but I really love it, of OCD as a magician. And ICBT can help us understand, how is the magician doing the trick, right? And once we can understand that, we can not fall for the trick anymore. And I've personally really enjoyed using ICBT. I was trained in ERP, as I think most people were, if you learned it a while ago. But with ICBT, I find that a lot of people beat themselves up when they have when the magical OCD theme comes through, because a lot of people really understand that rationally, like, there's no connection, or that rationally these compulsions don't really have this control, and yet they can't help themselves because it's still so scary, right? And the consequence of harm or something bad happening if they don't engage in these compulsions is still so great. And so what ICBT can help us do is to trace back to exactly when the compulsion started. And it often turns out to be something really understandable, right? So, for example, I have a client who was really scared because there were a lot of tornadoes happening where she was growing up when she was little. And so, whenever her parent would go outside, she would recite a prayer, or, kind of these well wishes for her parent to come back safe. And when the parent did come back safe, she would think, oh, okay, my thoughts and my prayers and my words really have an impact over my parents' safety. And so she learned that she can control and ensure her loved one's safety through her thoughts and actions. And then, of course, that generalized, and OCD sort of took hold of that.
Well, I have a question. So, like, if somebody, let's say, using ICBT and they're helping, they're kind of learning some of the stuff, right? And let's say, well, talking about magical OCD, but I'm thinking about, like, what if somebody really says, yeah, but there is a chance, right? There's, like, I know it's not that, like, I maybe doesn't totally matter, but there's a chance it could, right? What would you say to that?
Yeah. And I mean, I think this is where I go back to kind of, when thinking about ICBT, that it is this stepwise process. And so that there is a chance that does get addressed in, as we kind of move through the modules. But it's that we're not arguing with the possibility of the thing that the person with OCD is worried about. Like, there is always possibility. What we learn to look at is the difference between sort of this obsessional reasoning process that's happening in OCD, where there is an over reliance on possibility, and then there's dismissal of actual evidence that's happening, that we can have access to from our senses, that's being actively dismissed, and these irrelevant associations. And so it's not that there isn't a possibility. It's that, is this possibility relevant to the present moment in time? And that is something that I think typically you would need to kind of actually move through this learning process of ICBT to be able to kind of understand, oh, yeah, just because something is possible, like anything is possible, right? Like the ceiling could fall on my head right now, but I'm not worrying about it. So possibility is not enough.
Yeah.
And even probability is not enough, right?
Right. It's relevance, like you said, right? The relevance and context and like what's actually what is your environment? What's everything around you when you actually look at it and take it in? What does it tell you? Right. So you make an educated, informed guess or conclusion, right? An inference. That's what we call it, right? So, and we do that all the time, frankly. And we do this very much so not even fully thinking about it. Some things are almost automatic. But when it comes to OCD, I certainly learned through ICBT myself, the whole process of what ICBT targets is inferential confusion and really grasping, well, what the heck's an inference and why, what do you mean I'm confused? And, once you start to really wrap your brain around that, oh yeah, and an inference really is an educated guess that we're making. And how we typically make those guesses that lend themselves to then take action is we usually use common sense. We use what we can observe, right? We use also just some common knowledge that we've gathered over just being alive. Like, we put that together generally and pretty quickly say, okay, like I'm looking at something called a water bottle and I make an inference like that's a water bottle, right? It's not a highlighter. It's not a Sharpie. And I'm pretty clear about that. So, I love that you named that and kind of highlighted that because that definitely is, I think, like you said, it really is a process and a journey you go through to kind of slow down and work in this different way, to understand how we might be misapplying or over relying on just pure possibility. And because I think there's so much anxiety internally and all these things are happening that like we get locked into this and kind of suddenly dismiss and forget all this other information in favor of that. Very different approach.
Yeah. I think what I found to be really helpful is also how validating ICBT can be for clients. And it kind of shows them like, yeah, there's a reason for why you so strongly believe in this, that this compulsion is just kind of so important to do. And otherwise, like, it's so scary not to do it. There's a reason why you believe that, right? And like, there's a reason for why these, they're called sort of irrelevant associations. Like they're not relevant in the current context. And yet to you, they seem so compelling, right? Well, I mean, like in my example, right? Like if it goes back to something that was really scary or really formative, right? There, a lot of the time, personal experience, it's not the only category, but it's one that I think always shows up in the irrelevant associations. The others may or may not, the facts, the rules, etc. But the personal experience is always there.
Well, I mean, we're talking about like we're not in a vacuum, right? It's not like OCD, and I will say, even for me, when I was first, getting my training and everything, there was this piece of thinking like, oh, like somehow OCD is just kind of its own entity and thing, and then granted, some people have trauma histories or other things, some don't, and still can have severe OCD, right? With this, and over time, of course, with doing the work, like I started to kind of think like, man, but it seems like there's other things that are still part of just my human experience that kind of come here, but I still didn't make the link. And then with this, even for me, when I was learning and kind of stepping back and relooking, I was like, oh yeah, wait a minute. Like I know why, like, for example, I have relationship OCD. Like I know exactly why ROCD is my vulnerability and such a big topic. A big piece of it absolutely has to do with the way that I was raised and the immediate environment with my mom and my parents and how relationships were and how dynamics were. There was things there that were like the perfect fertile ground to create kind of we could say insecurities, some esteem stuff, that then led to that particular vulnerability, that then anything that had to do with relationally, my goodness, my brain would go haywire. And, I just didn't know it at the time. Right. But like, it helped to put it together And to, again, like I say, nowadays, it's like, it's not in a vacuum, and again, and there are some people where, they might not have had, it's not like we're saying you have to have some big dramatic history. You don't,
Right.
but
Yeah.
but it is about stopping and kind of relooking again, like you said, right? Like, let's go back for a second. When this all first started for you, what was going on at that time? And again,
Mhm.
it doesn't have to be a big dramatic situation, but it could be that, I don't know, I didn't do something in a way that felt right for me. And then I, had this suddenly anxiety, or it was a moment of stress and suddenly I got this anxiety or panic attack that seemed out of nowhere. But then from that, boom, this association got made. And suddenly I started to formulate this belief that, oh, whoa, something scary is happening here. Now I have to do X, Y, and Z. So it can also show up like that. And we form these beliefs as humans in general, I think, so rapidly. It's not like we're always slow and methodical and conscious and reflective, right? Some of the stuff just really happens almost on the background and very fast. And so, like you're saying, right? Like, also to slow down and look back again. And I love that you said that, right? Like, well, what was going on at the time when this first was showing up for you? And how did that start, where you thought you made this link in your brain that, oh, I got to do this, or this seems to help, and so I better do more of it?
Absolutely. I'm just like resonating and agreeing with everything you're saying. Like I've got my own OCD where like for me, that was what I loved about I-CBT, was just like certain things connected that I had never connected before from an, ERP lens. And I love ERP, not putting down ERP. It is effective. It works. It's great. And I-CBT offers this different perspective. And I also want to note that like OCD is a complex biopsychosocial disorder. So we're not saying that if you experience something, right, like that, it's necessarily going to turn into OCD, right? Two people can sort of have the same life experiences, traumatic or not traumatic, and it can or cannot turn into OCD, right? It may or may not, and that depends on your genetic vulnerability and other factors. Yeah, I've found that I-CBT has been really, really helpful. And also, I think from that piece of adding in more compassion, and I'm really big on compassion. I also practice and teach mindful self-compassion. And I think there's just so much, and like bringing people back to being able to trust themselves,
Yeah.
is so meaningful and gratifying for me as
Yeah.
a therapist, that I think, I-CBT.
Yeah, no, I have the same stance with you. I love both ERP and I-CBT, frankly. And I think it's, there's no need to argue or fight over this, even
For sure.
professionally or otherwise. I'm like, whatever helps the person, right? Like, I currently have some folks who I work with in my practice who we do ERP and it's effective and is wonderful. And then I have some people who are like, we do I-CBT, effective and wonderful.
Yeah.
Whatever works. There's always, of course, people who it doesn't matter what you're doing. It's just something else is going on and we can't quite make traction. So we have to look at other options. So, I want to just put out there for anybody listening, there's not like this was the magic pill, because I think for folks with OCD, there's always, and I certainly know I was looking for that at one point before I finally learned some things and changed my opinion. But I was looking for the one, like, what's that magic pill? What's the thing I could do that, okay, this is going to be the thing. This is the thing that's going to end all of it. And the truth is, with all the training I even have, and I apply this stuff for my own life, it's like, I still have things that come up. I mean, it's not like it disappears completely, but your relationship to yourself and to this part of yourself completely changes. So you start to treat it very differently. I feel like you're able to put it back in its place, if you will, and kind of get back into living your life.
Yeah. Very well said.
Oh, you're sweet. Well, I love that you also do that compassionate, mindfulness-based training. I didn't know that. So that was awesome to hear. And so anybody listening today, if they're like, oh my gosh, I love this, I love what I'm hearing, and they would love to find you, how can they find you?
Yeah, the best place is my website. So it's compasscbt.com.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
You're so very welcome. And thank you for having me.